Okay, I'll be mostly following the handout to try to stick to the time allowed. So this will be an appraisal of one of the most influential papers on current theories of fiction, David Lewis's Truth in Fiction from 1978, an appraisal from a current perspective. So I'll first find important to distinguish through different kinds of fictional discourse. This is a standard distinction that Lewis implicitly does in the paper, as do other very influential people writing in these times. Kripke, Van Inwagen. But I'm using that terminology from my friend Andrea Bonomi, which I find apt. So there is first what I call textual discourse, T. This is the use. These are not kind of sentences or abstract entities, but uses of them. So this is the use by the creator of a fiction, in this case by Conan Doyle on Studying Scarlet. This is characterized because intuitively, I emphasize this is just a matter of intuitions. There are theories on which this discourse is equally truth up. But intuitively, we wouldn't fault Conan Doyle because say this is false because Holmes does not exist or anything like that. Then there is what I call paratextual discourse, P, with or without the this introductory part, this operator, and what is characteristic of it is that it's the sort of use of language that we employ to report on what goes on in the fiction, the character of the relevant fictional world, the plot or narrative. And this is, unlike the previous one, this is intuitively truth up. We can, in this case, we would intuitively classify this as true, but if we change, we take away the negation, we will classify it as false. And then we have the metatextual, which is equally intuitively truth evaluable like P, but intuitively is not prefixable. If we put a prefix like the one I had in the paratextual case as optional, intuitively it will be false. Then the claim in that sense is not prefixable. But as I said, this is just a matter of intuitions. There are theories on which this should be also handled by assuming some kind of prefix. Now, Lewis's theory is a theory of mostly of the paratextual uses, but as we will see, to develop that, and as I think anybody should, he needs to assume a theory of textual discourse, a theory of fiction. As we will see, unlike, for instance, Kripke and Van Inwagen in their works of this time, he assumes that the textual uses have a semantic proper, which I say I take to be right. We'll find further reasons later, but the idea is that proposals to imagine by fictions are uses of sentences, or at least this is what I would claim. This is one of the many controversial things I will say, and in this case is one that I will not take up here. So Stefano Predelli, for instance, in a recent book that I will be mentioning, has been developing this Kripke Van Inwagen view that textual uses they don't have a semantics proper, but well, yeah, as I say, Lewis assumes the opposite, and I think he was right. He also assumes that part of their semantics is a propositional content, which is plot or narrative of fictional world that we are trying to get at in paratextual uses. And he assumes that this can be modeled as a set of possible worlds. Again, this assumption I take to be right too, although I mean, in the paper on which this is based, I point out that perhaps some more recent accounts of contents, like I mean, in fact, the small worlds accounts inspired by other papers by Kripke, or situations, or even some appeal to impossible worlds for some of the objections that are famously made to Lewis, and I will not consider here, would be preferable to the ones that Lewis assumes. But in any case, any of these views I think are much better than others, because they make contents abstract enough so that in principle, at least, a literary work and a film adaptation may have, in principle, as I say, at least the same content. And I think that is very important and a plus for this sort of theories that Lewis was assuming. Now, one of the main philosophical worries that Lewis was trying to address is posed by prima facie empty names like Holmes in textual and paratextual discourse. Lewis, at the beginning of the paper, for several reasons, to discard what he calls Mainongian accounts, by which he doesn't just mean, Graham Priest was just talking, he doesn't mean, strictly speaking, Mainongian views, but any view in which Holmes refers to a fictional character, which is not a real life person. Any view in which Holmes, in fact, refers, and it refers to some more or less exotic entity. So, for instance, Mainongians, on this extended sense that Lewis's uses apply also to Salmon's or Predelis or Stocke's views, or Kripke's or Van Inwagen's for paratextual discourse. As I said, they think that textual discourse don't have a semantics. In this case, I don't find terribly convincing Lewis's arguments. Moreover, he puts explicitly aside from his consideration metatextual uses, which are precisely the basis on which Mainongians, in this extended sense, build their theories. But again, this will not show up here, but I would say, so we should do a kind of global comparison between the proposal that Lewis makes, especially on paratextual discourse, and some extensions that we can think of a similar view for metatextual discourse, and we should compare that with these Mainongian views in his sense, and so this would be part of my global appraisal. I think Lewis's account, if modified along the lines that I will suggest, improves on them. But as I say, this is not, unfortunately, something that I will be able to consider here. So what he wants to do, the main goal of his paper, is to provide an account of paratextual uses that is not Mainongian, that doesn't ascribe an actual reference to Holmes. So for that purpose, I have been saying that in paratextual discourse, we try to characterize the content of fictions. So why not just say, and this is the first option that he considers as our theory of truth in fiction, as our theory of fictional content, of what is the content of fictions really. Why cannot we just say that the world of a fiction like I study in Scarlet are those, as he puts it, where the plot of the fiction is enacted, where a course of events takes place that matches the story. Now, in considering this option, which seems intuitive enough, we use this apparatus of possible walls, but we just use them to characterize this intuitive notion of the plot or the story that a fiction tells. Lewis worries about circularity. I am not in general, I don't think that in general we should worry so much about circularity in philosophy. I think that we should take this kind of worries about to what extent a proposal is explanatory enough, perhaps in comparison with others. And I think that this is, in any case, this is the way I suggest we should consider the worry that Lewis raises. And we can see that this intuitive theory is philosophically wanting. For instance, there is this intuitive idea, again, as almost everything has been challenged by some people. I cannot address their reasons, but we have the intuitive idea that fictions, the content of fictions goes beyond the explicit. Trivial ideas would be that Holmes has 2 nostrils, not 3, although this is not explicit in the fiction. So we should elaborate on this idea of the plot of a fiction so that we explain how implicit content is added to fictions. In that sense, the intuitive theory is not explanatory enough, in contrast with what Lewis has to offer in terms of well-known principles that have been discussed on that we just appeal to what obtains in the actual world, to the extent that is compatible with what is explicit in the fiction, or that we appeal to what is mutually believed, what are shared beliefs at the time when the fiction was created. This is, again, something that I'm not going to elaborate on or discuss here. But obviously, the proposals that Lewis makes complete or develop in philosophically interesting ways this intuitive proposal. There is an additional issue that worries Lewis and shows, again, that at least this almost pre-theoretical theory that what is truth in fiction is what obtains, consists in its plot. And this comes from a worry raised by Kripke, originally against descriptive theories of names. And this is the worry that I set up here. Let's use Holmes' soup, ASIS, for the homonym of this shape, Holmes, deployed by Conan Doyle in the sentence, the utterance T at the beginning. Fictionally, in the content of this fiction, this homonym refers, because Watson uses it to refer to his friend. So it's true in the fiction that this homonym, the one that we find in the fiction, refers. However, in the intuitive sense of plot or narrative, the actual world may be one at which the plot of this story is enacted. As Lewis puts it, that would be improbable, incredible, but surely possible. And nonetheless, in the actual world, this homonym, at least intuitively speaking, does not actually refer. Conan Doyle merely pretends to refer with it, but if the story is fiction, he was not referring with it. So this would be one case in which this intuitive theory could fail, or at least leaves us with no explanation, with no answer. There is something that is intuitively true in that fiction, but it's not the case at one of the walls at which the plot of the fiction is enacted under the improbable assumption. So I was saying, Luis handles this first worry with his influential reality and mutual belief proposals for implicit content that I am not going to go into in this presentation. What he does for the second, in the terms in which I am presenting his proposal, is expanding this intuitive sense of plot or narrative beyond merely material mode content to include also formal mode metalinguistic content. In particular, it would be in this extended sense of the intuitive notion of a plot or the content of a narrative. It would be part of the content of the fiction that we are discussing, that in fictional worlds enacting the narrative, the utterance T is actually assertorically uttered as known fact by a fictional teller, Watson in that case. And hence this homonym that we were talking about is part of the plot that this homonym is used to refer. If we extend this intuitive notion of plot beyond the material mode content to include these metalinguistic aspects, then even in the improbable and incredible but possible situation that Kripke contemplates, the actual goal is not anymore one of those in which the plot, thus metalinguistically enlarged, is enacted. And then this proposal would improve on the intuitive one with which we have started in philosophically significant ways. And this is most of what I'm going to discuss in what follows. This move by Luis is apt for this fiction, studying Scarlet, because this fiction has an explicit fictional narrator, Watson. However, it's doubtful that it works in general. And this is what I like to, as I said, this is what I will be focusing on in this presentation. What we need to properly confront these issues, so we are assuming that fictions have contents and paratextual uses try to get at them. So to the extent that fictions have contents, to the extent that they have a semantics, as Luis assumes, they have a metasemantics. There should be an account of how these contents are grounded, an ontology of fictions that tells us how the fictions have come to have the contents that we assume that they have. And what I'm going to try to show is that, well, Luis, in fact, realizes this, and he provides a metasemantics that supports his metalinguistic take on this notion of plot or content of fictions. But this metasemantics that he provides in the core of the paper is misguided, or this is what I will try to show. However, he has 4 postscripts that he published when he published the paper in his philosophical papers in 1983. He has 4 postscripts, and in one of them he gestures to what I will suggest is the proper metasemantics. So this is what I will try to convince you that we would get. Hanley has a paper on these issues that is called "As Good as It Gets." He refers to Luis's account, and what I will try to suggest, although I'm leaving aside many issues, for instance, about the generation of implicit content and other issues, but partially, at least, I will try to suggest that by moving from this metasemantics that he has in the core, in the main paper, to the one that he suggests in the postscripts, we can get his proposals on truth in fiction to be as good as it gets, as Hanley puts it. So this metasemantics this ontology of fictions that Lewis assumes is the idea that storytelling is pretense, as he puts it. And this is, I take it, this is a version of a view that CILEM presented in a paper a few years before Lewis's paper, although Lewis does not refer to CILEM, but this was a view very common those days. I think that most analytic philosophers share this view. Certainly Wagen, Kripke, in the papers, in their works in this period, they were assuming a similar view. So this is the view that fictions are mere pretense. They are constituted by the simulation of speech acts like assertions or questions. They are pretense, but not just pretense, because as I will say, the alternative view also agrees that fictions could be constituted by pretense. The emphasis is in mere. There is nothing more to fictions than these pretenses. In particular, as CILEM argues, they are not the result of sui generis dedicated to representational practices of a specific kind. I'll call it fictionalizing or fiction making. A type of speech act analogous to promises or assertions or questions should be accounted for along the same ways, of course, but with its distinctive, dedicated peculiarities. I was saying that that was, if one looks at it, that was the most extended view at the time that Lewis was writing among analytic philosophers. Nowadays, a few people endorse still variations of CILEM's argument, but mostly accept Corrie's and Walton's objections. In fact, in part, this paper was motivated by Stefano Predeli's trying to attempt to resurrect something like CILEM's view. And in fact, he has a compelling argument, more compelling than CILEM's himself, which I will discuss in a moment. So I will be calling MP to this view, that this metasemantics, this view, ontology of fiction that Lewis assumes in the paper itself. And I will be calling DR, dedicated representation view, to the alternative. So I take Walton's, in fact, to have been mostly influential for the demise for most people in current discussion of these issues of MP. On Walton's view, fictions are social artifacts that prescribe imaginings. Greg Corrie offered a Gricean speech act version in the same year as Walton published his magnum opus. For Corrie's non-fictionality, assertive utterances are constituted by Gricean reflexive intentions to produce belief, while fictionalizing by corresponding intentions to produce imaginings. I myself have developed a view which is a kind of rapprochement between Walton and Corrie, which is a sort of Austinian constitutive rules account of fictionalizing, inspired, in fact, based to a very good extent in Tim Williamson's account of assertion. But we don't need to go into these details. We just need the contrast between the mere pretense view and the dedicated representation view for the sort of considerations that I want to make. Now, CILEM, in his article, briefly considers DR and offers, as I said, he explicitly rejects this sort of view on the basis of a short argument. The premise for this argument is one that I have already granted on behalf of Lewis, but I would defend it myself. I will indicate some reasons later. The premise is that the illocutionary act of or acts performed in the utterance of a sentence is a function of the meaning of the sentence. We know, for instance, that an utterance of the sentence "John can run the mile" is a performance of one kind of illocutionary act, and that an utterance of the sentence "Can John run the mile" is a performance of another kind of illocutionary act, because we know that the indicative sentence form means something different from the interrogative sentence form. Some people, in fact, Corey's argument against reply to CILEM rejects this premise, but I think we can grant that there should be literal, direct ways. I mean, to the extent that fictionalizing is a dedicated representational act, there should be ways of literally, directly making it, and I think there are. I will indicate them in a moment. So my problem with CILEM's argument doesn't lie in the premise, but then CILEM attempts what looks like a reduction ad absurdum of the dedicated representation view from this premise. He says that it follows from the premise that if fictions make representational acts other than non-fictions, we are, quote, committed to the view that words do not have their normal meanings in works of fiction, from which it would absurdly follow that, quote, to read any work of fiction, a speaker of the language would have to learn the language all over again, since every sentence in the language would have both a fictional and a non-fictional meaning. This is a bizarre argument. Granted the assumption, granted the premise, some expressions in fictions must have specific meanings, indicating that it's fiction that we are discussing. But why all? Why should we learn the whole language? In the case of the contrast between the indicative and the interrogative, it was just two expressions, the expression indicating declarative mood and the expression indicating interrogative mood. All the others may have, and in fact have, the same meaning. Well, there are other objections. I'm going to skip. Greg Curry and Walton has this other overgeneration and undergeneration objections that are also significant, but I will skip them. So I move to 13. So this was not a very convincing argument. Now Stefano Predelli, in a series of recent works, provides an alternative abductive argument and uniformity argument, as he calls it. And this is his argument. Any satisfactory theory of fiction must inevitably account for interforce relations that are parallel to the relationships between straightforward speech acts such as assertions or requests. This is the premise of the, or this is the main abductive premise. There are these interforce relationships in discourses that any theory should account for. And the problem, he points out, is that we find exactly the same regularities that govern actual speech acts, that govern non-fiction discourse. We find them in fiction. So because this is his reason to agree with CILEM that fictionality does not bring up yet another type of force, because there is no, as it were, significant interforce relationships difference in non-fiction discourse and fiction discourse. So for illustration, consider these two sentences. I say the cat is on the mat, and then is the cat on the mat? This sounds bad or strange, jarring in a standard context. And this is because of these interforce relationships. The erotetic force of the second part is in tension with the assertoric force indicated by the first part. And the idea is that if we find these two sentences in a fiction, it would sound equally jarring, equally bad. For a second example, if I say it was John who stole the camera and someone stole it, that sounds bad. And this is because the first part of the first conjunct has a presupposition, and the second asserts that presupposition. Again, these are interforce relationships, and Predeli points out that typically if we find this sentence in a fiction, it would sound equally jarring. Now, I don't think this argument works. I should say that there are indications of it in Sale's paper. It's not just that Predeli makes it up. He agrees that the other argument is not good, but he finds in Sale's text this other argument. It certainly improves on Sale's, but I don't think that the argument works. In the first place, the dedicated representation account can account for this, for the uniformity that we find in fiction and non-fiction. So let us say with Nichols and Stick that pretense. Let's characterize pretense as follows: to pretend that P is roughly to behave in a way that is similar to the way one would or might behave if P were the case. So a person who wants to pretend that P wants to behave more or less as he would if P were the case. Now, one of the goals for which we engage in pretense is that of conveying dedicated speech acts. So at least in some cases of irony, this is what we are doing. We pretend to be asserting that Peter is a very good friend, but we are doing that with the goal of conveying a different speech act than the one that we are pretending to make. In this case, the assertion that Peter is a very bad friend. So we can pretend to apologize with the ultimate goal of scolding somebody, doing a different dedicated speech act. Given DR, authors of literary fictions may convey their fictionalizing acts by pretending to perform the locutionary acts meant by their utterances. In fact, on Walton's account, the authors of literary fictions, with their they use the locutionary meanings of the sentences that they use as Walton puts it, as props in games of make-believe. Or the authors of drama, they just have actors pretending to perform speech acts, and this is one recourse that they use to create their stories. So this explains the uniformity that Predeli finds in fiction and non-fiction. It's explained in that it's compatible with DR that in many cases fictionalizing is done by pretending to do ordinary speech acts. I didn't present these other objections, so I will not go into that. So this shows that the argument is as an abductive argument is not good, because there is an alternative explanation compatible with the alternative theory that fictionalizing is a specific speech act. And moreover, the uniformity is limited. There is the uniformity that I have illustrated following Predeli, but later I'll mention that there are other cases that show that fictionalizing has its own specificity, and the uniformity may well break down and breaks down in many cases of fictionalizing. Okay, so far have replied to, well, I have repeated the standard responses to Searle's original argument for the MP view of fiction, of the textual discourse. And I have also replied to Predeli's new, better argument for something like that. Now I move to the attack, as it were. I move to the main reasons why MP is not a good theory of textual discourse, of the ontology of fictions. So some fictions, like the Sherlock Holmes stories or Don Quixote or Pale Fire, Nabokov's Pale Fire, they have explicit fictional narrators. Explicit narrators, as this term is understood for my purposes, they have two features. They are fictional and they are agents, says Kanye. But more specifically, we should say they are fictional tellers for fictional assertoric acts made with the declarative sentences that we find in verbal fictions. So it's not that they are just agents. What Watson or the first personal narrator of Don Quixote are doing is asserting things, fictionally, of course, but they are asserting things. This is what is distinctive of fictional narrators, as I am using the term. By the way, it's not necessary that they are fictional. So they could be, in the case of Don Quixote, there are very good reasons to think of this first personal narrator as Cervantes himself. So the important thing is not whether or not they are fictional. The important thing, so they can be fictionalized versions of real people. The important thing is that what they are doing in the fiction is telling the contents of the fictions. So here is Corrie's emphasizing this aspect of fictional narrators. Now, as I said, it's compatible with the that fiction makers, fictionalizers like Doyle, tell their stories by, as it were, playing the role of fictional tellers, fictional narrators. And this is the way we can think of Doyle with Watson. Doyle is, as it were, an actor playing the role of Watson. Cervantes is playing the role of these first personal narrators. There also allows us to assume effaced or covert narrators in fictions without explicit narrators, like the Jane Austen novels. And I agree that, and in fact, my acceptance, my partial acceptance of the uniformity argument suggests that that I'm happy to agree with Predeli, for instance, or with other people, that there are many more narrators than just explicit narrators. For instance, I think that there are very good reasons to think that in Jane Austen novels, there is also a covert effaced or implicit narrator, which in fact we have very good reasons to identify with Austen herself. However, and this is the main difference and the significant difference between MP and DR, MP requires that fictional narrators are ubiquitous. And Lewis, in fact, in the core of the paper, assumes that, because as we have seen, he assumes that the character of a fiction is conveyed by a fictional narrator making the utterances that constitute, according to him, the fiction. So he's assuming with what Derek Matravers calls the report model. In reading a novel, a reader makes believe that he's being given a report of actual events. In other words, he makes believe the content of the novel is being reported to him as known fact by a narrator. So given this MP assumption, this ontology of fictions, fictional worlds always include the reporting of their character as known fact by a teller, explicit or implicit. And this is what DR is not committed to. DR can agree, of course, agrees that some fictions are conveyed by this recourse to a fictional narrator explicit in the fiction, and can agree that sometimes fictional contents are given by this trick of assuming an implicit fictional narrator. But there is no need for this to be always the case, because according to DR, fictionalizing is a speech act of its own that can be done without being parasitic on other speech acts, in particular the tellings of a fictional narrator. So here is my reason to think that, in fact, fictionalizing can be indicated directly, literally. A declarative sentence can be literally, directly put forward for purposes other than what Tim Williamson calls flat-out assertion. I can say, "Yes, I suppose." I can hedge, and then I'm indicating that S is not supposed to be taken as a flat-out assertion. And I think that this is as literal as it can be. Maybe it's not a default speech acts. We need to do some kind of hedging or indicating that we are not flat-out asserting. We are supposing or guessing. But in doing that, we are using language directly and literally. And by the same token, we can say "es, let's imagine," or "es, once upon a time." And the way I understand that, this would be textual discourses that literally convey acts of fictionalizing. As David Davis points out, it's very weird to assume that thought experiments, which are proposals to imagine, are conveyed by fictional narrators. They are directly put forward by the philosopher who is presenting the thought experiment. So there could be fictions generated in this way. And so I agree with Walton and Wilson that, in fact, there are. Wilson provides this illustration. It's just an illustration, but is similar to the case of the thought experiment. Wilson mentions the production of certain hand shadows, a fictional story in which a certain hawk attacks and kills a hapless mole. He says there is no obvious reason to postulate that the hand shadows are themselves the fictional product of some fictional activity of showing as actual the element of the depicted tale. Of course, these are just appeal to intuitions. The intuition that in these cases the fictions are conveyed directly without this trick of assuming a fictional teller. And as I was saying, I think that even, I'm focusing on the literary case, but I'm also mentioning cases of fictions conveyed in other media. And I think it's important to keep them in mind. So one could say we can assert with pictures. For instance, documentaries are a kind of assertions. So in principle, the defender of MP could assume that a fictional film has some kind of teller who is presenting the fictional world as if it was a kind of documentary. As in an assertoric mode. So in principle, the idea is perfectly acceptable, and not only that, I think I have argued in agreement with Wilson or with Walton, Wilson in particular, that many films should be taken this way. But there is no need for that to be the case always. And so these two cases are just the case of thought experiments, and this example of the hand shadows by Wilson are just appeal to this intuition based on a philosophical theory of fictions, DR, that there could be fictions whose contents are directly given to us by the fiction maker. Now, in the next three items in the handout, I mentioned real cases, so that not to just appeal to these intuitive cases. 3 cases in which fictional content is given to us in this way, directly by a fictionalizer, which in my view show that DR is a better theory of fictions and textual discourse than the mere pretense account. So one of these cases is the case of unreliable narrators. I'm not going to read these particular examples. You can do it on your own. But in the case of unreliable narration, the unreliable narrator, some of what the unreliable narrator tells us is not true in the fiction. Maybe what is true in the fiction is just the negation of what the unreliable narrator tells us. These are contents. So the Kimbo tells us P, and if we are understanding the fiction properly, we realize that it's not P that is true in the fiction. In the fiction, it's merely true that Kimbo tells us P, but P is not true in the fiction. What is true in the fiction, in fact, is something else, perhaps not P. I'm suggesting here how we make these inferences, which again, a good way to explain how we make these inferences presupposes DR. It presupposes that, so given DR, there should be indirect ways of conveying contents based on the assumption that the agent is fictionalizing and not doing any other act. And this is the way I am suggesting here we understand that unreliable narration. But in any case, here we have examples, these contents that we infer, given what the unreliable narrator says, that that are not given to us as a report, because what is given to us as a report is simply not true in the fiction. We have to infer it in some other way, as I suggest here, in fact, by assuming something like DR. So this was the sort of examples that I mentioned in 22. These are not the most decisive ones, because at least in these cases, there are narrators. In the case of unreliable narrations, part of the content of these fictions are given to us by a narrator, an explicit narrator, typically. I'm just saying that other parts, sometimes crucial parts, are not given to us by the narrator, but in some other way, which I'm suggesting presupposes DR. In 23, I mentioned other cases. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of the case, the most compelling case that I use. I just ask you to think of Kafkian or surrealist stories in general. They, as many people have put it, if you think that these stories are presented to you as known fact, you would just infer that the agent is mad, and you wouldn't infer anything from that. You wouldn't get any content for them. And so these are cases similar to the previous one, in that perhaps there is some narrator, but the crucial elements of what these fictions convey to us are not inferred, are not derived by assuming that they are given to you by a teller, by a fictional narrator. In 24, I mentioned other cases that are even more interesting, in the sense that it could be that the whole thing, the whole fiction, is not given to you by any fictional narrator. There is no part of it that is given to you by a fictional narrator. The cases I mentioned can be here the problem that defenders of MP could find lies in that you may think that these are just postmodernist, strange cases, and the ones that I mentioned have this feature. But this is just because they make the case more compelling. So this would be cases in which it's clear, or it should be clear for someone properly understanding the fiction, that it is not given to you by a teller, but is given to you, is presented to you explicitly as a fiction. It's presented to you explicitly for you to realize that that it is fiction, and the fictionalizer has recourse to all kind of ways of making it clear that this is what is going on. As for instance, does Berman in persona, including a camera in the alleged fictional world. These are not, by the way, that this objection that these are postmodern cases. In fact, you can find cases like this all across the history of fiction. But again, I'll leave it the point here. So these three cases, by the way, show that this uniformity that Predelli appeals to breaks down. I mean, in these cases, what these cases show is that someone creating a fiction, someone fictionalizing, has ways specific to fiction to indicate that this is what he or she is doing, and for the audience to grasp what he is doing. And those recourses, if you found them in something that is, you are clear that is supposed not to be a fiction, if you found those recourses, these Kafkian themes, or these explicit, I am making this as a fiction cases, if you find them in an article in the New Yorker, in a Reporter at Large article, you could just simply not get what is going on. So it's not true that there is this wholesale uniformity that Predelli assumes. Okay, so I think that this establishes that DR provides, I'm not going into which version of DR, but DR in general is a much better view of fiction, of the ontology of fiction and textual discourse than MP, and that it deals well with, in fact, with some of these worries that I have mentioned are considered by Lewis himself. So that a Lewisian, someone who wants to defend Lewis's account of fictional, of paratextual uses, of ascriptions of content to fictions, would be much better off and would, in fact, preserve most of the things that Lewis says by abandoning, by forgetting about this idea that fiction is pretense, in the sense that in the main body of the article, Lewis assumes that I'm moving to some version of DR, which one depends on which one offers the best account of all these cases and other issues. I conclude by, as I said, one of the main worries for Lewis was defending his anti-Meinongian view in this extended sense. This is something I haven't gone into, and I don't have the time to go into, but I just conclude by claiming that you could also avoid any form of Meinongianism. You could also avoid, for instance, the form of Meinongianism that Predelli in earlier work, or people like those that I mentioned here, I mentioned before, following Salmon 1998, or Stoke, people who try to deal with empty names by ascribing to them a referent, even if it is some exotic entity in textual discourse. You could avoid that also by assuming DR and some adequate semantics, not very far away from what Luis was assuming. I gave you here some references in 25. But that would be all. Thank you for listening.